Good evening, Apush. I'm about to give you period 8, part 2. We're talking about domestic policy. And again, domestic policy at home, foreign policy abroad, just to make sure we understand. And again, period 8 is 1945, end of World War II, until 1980, which is the election of Ronald Reagan in November of 1980. So a key theme of understanding period 8 is the rise of liberalism. We're talking, started in the progressive era, goes to the New Deal and FDR. It's really this idea that the government can fix the country's problems. And we see that specifically with President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, right? The war on poverty, creating all these programs that are going to help Americans. And again, a big federal government. So programs like Head Start for free preschool, Job Corps, Medicare, Medicaid, health insurance for the elderly and the disabled and poor. We have the Immigration and Nationality Act, which gets rid of those quotas from the 1920s on immigration. So new flocks of immigrants coming from Latin America, from Southeast Asia. We also have the Warren Court, which is led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, and we have a lot of decisions in the court that tend to expand democracy, tend to focus on protecting individual liberties. So cases like Griswold v. Connecticut in 1965, which was that right to privacy, basically between a woman and her doctor, and this idea that they could use birth control. We have Miranda v. Arizona, really famously 1966. This is a right to remain silent, right to an attorney that are seen as legitimate in the eyes of the Constitution. Obviously, we also have criticisms of liberalism, and I think that's a big part of this period as well. And those criticisms are from both the left and the right, from both sides. Start with the left. If we're thinking about this idea of liberalism, and specifically, presidential and sort of big government liberalism, many people on the left feel like it's not doing enough. Not enough done for civil rights, doing too much when it comes to foreign policy. It's getting into messes it shouldn't be getting into. Obviously, the escalation in Vietnam, the sort of bombing of Laos and Cambodia, the massacre at My Lai, just sort of immorality coming out in foreign policy. So that's a big criticism from the left. There's also, of course, like actual activist groups, sort of collectively called the New Left, the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. There's a Berkeley Free Speech movement. Just all of these groups and other civil rights groups that we're going to talk about later are sort of rising up and pushing on these sort of mainstream liberals to be more left. And that kind of culminates in the rioting that happens outside of the Democratic National Convention in 1968 in Chicago. So we, of course, also have criticism on the right. And I think this is a really important thread that kind of weaves its way through the 1960s, through the 70s, and up to Reagan's election in 1980. And that is the criticism on the right and the rise of conservatism. So, of course, the election of 1964, we have LBJ in a landslide beats Barry Goldwater, senator from Arizona, and my fifth cousin. But Goldwater's defeat also signals the rise of this sort of like conservative movement on the right. States' rights, small government, the government's too big, there's too much deficit spending, we're going broke. There's arguments about immorality, so like the idea of the counterculture and Roe v. Wade and these sort of immoral decisions by the federal government. The idea that the Supreme Court is sort of a activist judges, right? They're legislating from the bench, as people like to say. We of course have the election though of Richard Nixon and the kind of silent majority, those who are still supporting the war in Vietnam and those actions. And so ultimately the Republican right does have some victories, but ultimately that falls apart with Watergate specifically, and the kind of distrust with the Pentagon Papers. And then, of course, we have the rise of the Christian right and the sort of moral majority that ultimately leads, along with the sort of disillusion of Carter's Democratic Party, a very conservative Democratic Party, ultimately leads to Reagan's election in 1980. Now I want to talk about like civil rights, because that is a key theme also. With this liberalism, there's this question about, are they doing enough for civil rights? And so civil rights and justice is a really important theme of this period 8. So it starts all the way back in 1948 with the Executive Order 9981, and that is the executive order that desegregates the military. So President Truman passes, again, this is executive order, so it's not a law. It's done by the presidency. We also have Brown v. Board of Education, of course, that decision by the Warren Court that affirms Plessy v. Ferguson is dead when it comes to education specifically, and that it needs to basically be ended, this idea of segregation in schools, like immediately, although they don't say how that's going to happen. And of course, we have part of the Great Society and kind of the culminating acts of the movement. We have the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65. And also we have the amendment to the Constitution, the 24th Amendment, that actually makes poll taxes unconstitutional, which is obviously a big deal, because that was a way to really prevent African Americans specifically, but many other minorities from voting. Obviously, though, this comes out of work and grassroots movements as well, and the government's role is one thing, but the actual movement itself from the ground up is important. So if we think all the way back to the Double V campaign, and Double V meaning double victory, victory at home and victory abroad, fighting against the Nazis, but also fighting racism in America, was a big movement, along with the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, and the NAACP, kind of rising in their status and their funding. And we have different ways of kind of fighting against these sort of systemic problems, things like legal challenges, pushing in court. Thurgood Marshall was a NAACP lawyer, pushed and argued the Brown v. Board. We have direct action, specifically, like doing stuff. And then we have the sort of veil of nonviolence, and this idea of nonviolent action will lead people like Dr. King, people like John Lewis. And specifically, so some specific actions that I think you should note, things like the Montgomery bus boycotts of 1955, which again were kind of set off by Rosa Parks, which was also set off by the lynching and murder of Emmett Till. And remember, so much of the lynching of the 1940s was done to African American soldiers, those who were in the military, who were sort of seen as stepping outside of their status. And so those bus boycotts in '55, the Greensboro sit-ins of 1960, the Freedom Riders of 1961, Freedom Summer, the voting campaign led by Fannie Lou Hamer, and SNCC. That's in 1964. But we also see the rise of more radical organizations, right? And this sense of real areas of sort of different tactics, right? We have the Watts riots in 1965, the push against police brutality. We have the Black Power movement by the former chairman of SNCC, Stokely Carmichael, who pushes for Black Power. We have Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, and this idea of separatism, of self-improvement by the Black community. And then, of course, we have the Panthers, the Black Panthers of Oakland, here in the East Bay. But, of course, as we know, that this push is going to get itself a pushback, and that's going to come intensely in direct action, in rhetoric, etc. So we get like the Southern Manifesto, which we saw as a reaction to Brown v. Board, kind of a rejection of these activist justices. We have the Little Rock Nine and the attempt to desegregate Central Little Rock High School, and Governor Orville Faubus basically not allowing these 9 black students to go to school, and President Eisenhower having to send the military in to escort them. And we have just general violence and assassinations, right? All throughout the 60s. Medgar Evers, leader in the NAACP, We have Dr. King, of course, and many other leaders, and not leaders, just people trying to fight for civil rights and being killed for it. So hugely important. We also have, and I wanted to sort of shift this to the women's rights movement as well. So women's rights movement, we obviously see a real push after World War II to sort of separate this idea of the workforce and how women see themselves in the workforce. And many women start to sort of step into that power and recognize that these sort of old gender norms and expectations of what women can and should do are norms they don't like and want to reject. So many women who were working during World War II when many men were off fighting are starting to reject the expectation that they're just going to go back home and raise kids and make dinner. So a really important book document for that would be Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, 1963. She really challenges this idea of a housewife. She herself was one and really felt incredibly lonely and kind of rejected this idea of sort of this gender role of what women should do. We have the creation of the National Organization of Women, or NOW, and kind of pushing for women's activism. We have the passing of Title IX, really big deal. This ends sex discrimination in schools. That's 1972. We, of course, have been talking recently about the Equal Rights Amendment and the fight to pass this amendment as obviously amending the Constitution. And unfortunately, its failure to do so, right? It is passed in many states, pushed forward and ratified by many states, but ultimately it does not succeed, mostly due to the pushback by Phyllis Schlafly and others in the No ERA movement campaign. And then, of course, Roe v. Wade, which obviously affirms a woman's right to privacy and legalizes abortion in 1973, which in itself has this sort of pushback effect of the rise of the pro-life movement and the sort of Christian fundamentalist movement. So the last thing I want to talk about is like sort of the economy and society and how those two things work together in this time period. So specifically, we obviously know that after World War II, we have all of these soldiers coming home, and we have the rapid rise of the middle class, right? We have an actual growing middle class in the late 40s and early 50s, specifically white Americans, a lot of social mobility, suburbanization, right? Moving into the suburbs, and those families are having lots and lots of kids, which we know are our good friends, the baby boomers. And remember, the GI Bill is a huge part of that, which was passed in 44, so it's out of our period 8, but it's in period 7. But the GI Bill is hugely important in terms of getting cheap housing, getting free college, a year's worth of unemployment if needed. So that really helps the former GIs who come home from World War II. We have a lot of economic growth because we are fighting in a Cold War, and we're fighting in this arms race, as I mentioned in part 1 of this period's videos. And so we have a big economic growth in the defense industry, right? We're building lots of missiles, lots of defense systems, etc. That, of course, leads to President Eisenhower in his farewell address in 1961 in January, pushing back against this military-industrial complex, this worry that the sort of economy that is being created successfully in America is very focused on the military. And what does that mean for America? And we also see this sort of difference in the growth in specific areas and the decay in others. So the Sun Belt, right? California, Florida, the South generally, Texas, Georgia, Arizona, this sort of growth in these places, especially conservatism in California, with obviously Richard Nixon in the rise in the 50s and Ronald Reagan in the 60s as the California governor. We also, of course, have the decay of the Rust Belt in places like my hometown of Detroit, in towns in Cleveland, Ohio, and Cincinnati, and other places, Milwaukee, places that are slowly being left behind due to deindustrialization and all the sort of stagnant economy issues that we've been talking about in the last couple of days. So the sort of separation, right? Growth in the South and West, decay in the Midwest. We also, of course, have just the rise of sort of this monoculture, right? TV. TV becomes the sort of homogenous way of thinking about America. It ties us together. It's sort of this national identity, which is an important theme in APUSH. But also we know, of course, that some people tried to challenge that. In the 50s, it was the Beats, it was rock and roll, it was Elvis. A lot of it was co-opting black music. That's, a big piece of Elvis and rock and roll. And sort of using the what is deemed, other and deviant, to sort of push this counter narrative. And that obviously rises even more as those baby boomers grow into that Great Society era and become hippies, right? The rise of the counterculture, sexual revolution, the sort of the creation of the pill, birth control. So this, being able to have sex and not get pregnant, like hugely important for the sort of counterculture and the women's rights movement. Fashion, obviously, music, drugs, as we talked about, drugs really lining up culturally with the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. And of course, the rise of the anti-war movement, right? This push against the idea of American exceptionalism abroad and the Cold War. It's saying no, we don't want that. And of course, we know that the rise of conservatism, the push against those sort of like liberalism values, at least they're seen as liberal values, makes sense and dovetails into the beginning, right? Which is this sort of push against the left with, small government, anti-Great Society. As Reagan says in his inaugurational address, right? The government is the problem. And this real belief in states' rights, in reframing this country from that lens is really important to the rise eventually of President Reagan in 1980. And of course, as we mentioned, also the slow move rightward of Christian fundamentalists and the moral majority and this idea of Christians and especially evangelical Christians becoming tied to the Republican Party under Reagan and onward. So I hope that helps. Good luck on the AP test and our assessment tomorrow, and I know you're going to do great.